everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that you will enjoy and will want to have you come on back for more. If you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get into the main event, if you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes of the podcast. Also, if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for those who would like to contribute to this platform by giving a donation, we have two places where you can do so. The first is Cash App, where the handle is $IDTALK4ED. And if you're on the Venmo, our handle is @Kwame SM. That's KWAMESM. And to catch future episodes of this podcast, of course, go to YouTube. But if you want to catch some past episodes, you can go to our main website at IdentityTalk4Educators.com. And as always, thank you all for the support. So these past few weeks, we've been going international. We've talked to educators from Senegal. We've talked to educators from Tanzania, educators from other parts of the globe. Well, today we're going to make a trip virtually to the United Kingdom. More specifically, we're going to hit neighborhood of Bristol, England. And we have a phenomenal guest that's going to share her journey on how she ended up doing this work that we love so much, education, and just some of the trials and tribulations she's gone through, but also some of the incredible work that she is doing right now within her neighborhood and beyond. So without further ado, I want to bring on Aisha Thomas to the podcast to talk with us about her journey and what she's been up to lately. So let's bring Aisha on. Hello.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I hope you're well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. So thank you.
Yes. And thank you for accepting the invitation. I'm so excited for this conversation. I just have so many questions. We're going to try to get through as many as possible. But even if we don't, that's all good. What's important is the audience gets what they want, and that's an organic conversation about what we love, and that's education. That's equity, that's justice, all the above. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Now, before we get into the actual work, we always like to start from the beginning. So as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, you grew up in Bristol, in England, and you had your childhood where you experienced some things. But I want to give you the floor to just share a little bit about your upbringing and what it was like growing up in Bristol.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because Bristol is really pivotal in the UK, because when we think about the relationship, particularly that Great Britain had in terms of, and I say Great Britain, quote unquote, in regards to colonization, and we think about the legacy, we would be remiss to not acknowledge that Bristol was one of the entrance points. So along with Liverpool, when certainly my elders were transported from the Caribbean in the Windrush generation, they landed in Bristol. And Bristol was really kind of instrumental when we think about enslavement. So certainly within the period when we were looking at the pandemic and all things were happening, all of a sudden Bristol was being spotlighted around the globe because of the toppling of the Colston statue, and acknowledging and understanding Bristol's relationship and grappling with racism and grappling with enslavement and what's happened. And to know that for a very long time, I was raised in a city, in a neighborhood, and I had no proximity or understanding to its colonial roots because it wasn't taught to us. it was almost like this hidden experience, almost this kind of dirty laundry that was hanging there, but nobody wanted to address it. And so for me, I grew up quite naive, if I'm being honest with you. So although I am Black, I come from a Caribbean heritage, my grandparents are Jamaican, I didn't really understand the severity of not understanding my history and not having that connection with my identity. So I went to a very multicultural primary school. So lots of different communities, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Caribbean, African, there were all sorts. And I didn't ever question difference. But then I went to secondary school in an area called South Gloucestershire. And most people there were racialized as white. So there was only 6 children that were kind of Black or from the global majority communities. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I'm different. Oh, there's something about me that doesn't fit. And my hair is different. My skin's different. I talk differently. And that was my baptism into racism. All of a sudden I realized that someone was going to treat me differently because of how I was racialized. And yet I didn't have the understanding. I had this kind of cognitive dissonance and I didn't quite understand why it was even happening. But all of a sudden, who I am means that I'm othered. I'm outside. I'm no longer inside the conversation, and I'm questioning who I am and how I show up. And you're beginning to get these nuggets of information because you're in lessons around history and enslavement, and you're seeing slavery images. And I'm going, hold on. That's where I came from. That's me. That's who we are.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I'm having to have this reckoning with the fact that I'm Black, and it now means something. And I went on a real discovery, and it was hard because all my friends were white. I was in a white community, and nothing positive was being talked about being Black in any shape or form. And so for me, my upbringing was really disconnected and really disjointed, which is why this work is so much more important to me now in 2024, because I went my whole entire childhood having no proximity to my Blackness, not knowing who I was, not understanding my cultural heritage, not understanding our origin story, not knowing about African kingdoms. In fact, growing up with a very negative view of Africa, the one that the Oxfam view, and really not knowing what the beauty and richness was of the continent. I had no idea. So it hurts me to say it, but I'm going to be honest with you, Kwame. My upbringing was very whitewashed. And it's not the woman I am today, but it took for me to go through that reckoning, for the veil to be lifted, for the glasses to come off, for me to go, oh, this Black skin means something. And all of a sudden, that's when I begin to go on this journey. What does it mean to be Black in the UK? What does it mean to be Black on this planet? And what do I need to do differently? And that was the beginning of my journey.
So you start to interrogate what's going on around you. You're experiencing all kinds of microaggressions left and right from all different angles. You're going through all these experiences. And then after you go through your university time, you decide you want to be a teacher. So what I want to know is, did you want to learn more about your Blackness and just the nuances of race play a significant role in you wanting to become an educator, or did that come a little later down the road?
That came a little bit later down the road, and there are 2 right reasons why I'm in the role I'm in today, and I have to separate them. So the first one is my mum, by trade, is a primary school teacher. So education has always been in my life. So my mum would take me and my brother to all of her different schools. So sitting in a primary school classroom, watching her teach, meeting children, being around education, that was always my portion. So I always understood that education was a passport, an opportunity, that knowledge was power and freedom, but I didn't understand the intersect of race. I just knew that education was important to an individual, and probably more through the lens of class and getting through and getting access than I did understanding that there was any kind of relationship to racial barriers or prejudice. So that was probably how it started from my mum. However, I actually am a law graduate. So actually, when I went to university, I read law. I was going to be a lawyer. That was my pathway. That was what I was going to do. And so my journey to education really is off the back of that. So I worked at a law firm, a commercial firm, when I first finished at university. And one of the things that we had to do was go and do like a pro bono support. We had to go and give back to the community, essentially. And I used to work for a charity volunteering called the Prince's Trust. And that charity was really about helping people in the community. And I was on a project which was about young boys who were in prison. And so we're talking about children between the age of 12 to 16. And I spent a long time mentoring these boys. And one particular boy was a black boy who I spent a lot of time working with. And my job was to kind of help him to think about what might be his educational steps once he leaves. But what was really interesting is that in one conversation that I had with this particular young man, he stopped me and he went, "If you were my teacher, perhaps I wouldn't be in prison today." And I didn't get what he meant, because I'm going, huh? Me? I'm just trying to do a little pro bono work and I'm going to be a lawyer, so I don't know what you're talking about. But what he made me realize is he went further and he said, no, you have to understand the representation I see as a black boy. I see go into media, I see go into sport, or I see crime. And look where I am now. Everyone in authority is racialized as white. They are white men. But if I had seen a teacher, someone that looked like me in authority, giving me educational knowledge, then maybe I wouldn't have taken the pathway that I did. And that was it, literally like night and day. And in that moment, I realized I can't be in a career where I'm helping them once they've already got into the system. If I have any chance of helping these black boys to change their trajectory, I got to get to them before they even go down that pathway. And where is the only place that's going to happen? Education. So it was at that point I left my legal career, transitioned into education, had to do retraining, and then moved into that position. And so it was literally night and day, and then a complete transition from law to education. And that's why I got into this process, because of that conversation with that young man.
And I would think that having that legal background has, in a way, informed some of the education work you do. When you think about the different legislation that's put out there, I don't know how it is in the UK, but just with regard to, let's say, for instance, special education laws or other laws dealing with diversity, or I know we call it DEI, but we have so many different iterations and it's like alphabet soup.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I'm wondering if that helped you with that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, understanding guidance and policy, being able to navigate the legal system that intertwines itself with education, my legal knowledge has not gone unused. If anything, it propelled me and put me on a different trajectory to some of my peers. And so when I moved into education, my specialism was safeguarding. So anything around the safety of the child, special educational needs, children who were adopted, fostered. To be honest, any child that was in education that was on the fringe, that was mine. That was my wheelhouse. That was like, yep, I'll have them. Any children like that, give them to me. And so creating policy and process that centered the child and gave them what they needed, because the education system wasn't always designed for them. That legal skill, that negotiation, that art of advocacy was really, really paramount to my role as assistant principal. And so I've never lost the art of the legal kind of perspective and knowledge, but I repurposed it and channeled it through education.
And I did get a chance to watch the short documentary when you were a principal and you were talking about the lack of black representation, the teaching profession in your hometown. And there was one clip where you posed a question to your class of students. You asked them, well, how many teachers do you believe are employed within the district? And of course, you had kids with the whiteboards that holding up all these different numbers. And you were like, 26.
Yeah.
26 black teachers at that time.
Yeah,
So that
wild.
was some years back. Now, I don't know if that number is increased or it's just stayed the same, but at that time, 26 black teachers, and I'm looking at their faces, they were in absolute disbelief.
Yeah. Yeah.
and
a
they had a
complete
pause for a second. Right.
And it's really interesting because I think they didn't understand it and they didn't get it. And it was fascinating to me because the more we did this research and the more we were kind of showcasing this knowledge, it wasn't just the children that had this kind of disconnect. It was the parents, it was the other teachers, it was the leadership, it was even our Department for Education. And you're going, but this is your data and you don't realize what's happening here. And when you know that 30% of the children were from the global majority, and yet there's only 26 Black teachers. And when we looked at our secondary schools, over half of them had 0 Black teachers in them. You really have to question, well, what's happening in this system? And is it that Black people aren't applying, or is the system so biased that they're not even getting on the teacher training program in the first place to complete, qualify, and then get the job and the opportunity at the end? And a lot of our work has been about holding the mirror back to that teacher training program, back to the universities, and saying, don't put it on the marginalized and say you're not applying. Look at your systems. Have you made it so difficult that it's only applicable for those who are racialized as white to navigate that system? And these are the things that we have to speak truth to power about. We have to be honest about. And there was a piece of research that happened in the UK a couple of years ago. And what they realized is, no, Black people are applying to university. They're just not being shortlisted for the course. And then you have to question why. Well, what prejudice and bias is happening in those processes that they don't even get on the course, let alone the ones that get on it and then don't make it to the classroom at the end. And so they are being filtered out. And yet you're saying there's not enough diversity, but do you want it? Or are you preventing it? Are you setting up an environment that's conducive for them to come in and thrive and be a part of it? And that was a lot of what the campaign was about, was holding the mirror back to them and saying, what are you really doing to make this happen? And if you don't do something soon, it's going to really begin to impact the engagement between the children and the staff.
Now, in the UK in general, well, let's just focus on England. Do you know of any accelerated programs that focus on bringing in teachers who are part of global majority into the profession, more specifically Black teachers? Because we know that universities, they got their way of doing things, but there are ways to get around that traditional track in order to filter more Black teachers in to the system.
Absolutely. So there are some key programs. So, for example, there are ones that focus on things like leadership. So there is one run by a wonderful lady called Nadine Bernard, and she runs an organization called Aspiring Heads. And that is all focused on helping those racialized as Black to navigate the education system and to move up and get those opportunities. So there are like really targeted opportunities. There are also organizations like Black Men Teach and Young Black Teachers Network, which are really focusing on helping with recruitment opportunities and highlighting and making sure that those who are from the global majority see the jobs that are available, have access to them, have support to apply, and have those opportunities to really take front and center. But what I would also say is the dioceses are really big. So church schools are massive in England. And so what you're also seeing is specific schemes from certain dioceses where they've now recruited particular people to work on the encouragement of getting Black teachers into their schools. So I would say there's a multifaceted approach that's taking place by a number of these organizations. But what I would also say is in the UK, we have a lot of trusts that run the schools now. So these kind of academy chains. And what they're realizing is that we independently need to look at the diversity. So they are now running their own internal programs where they're going out and going, right, where should we be advertising our jobs? How are we getting to these communities? You know, going out to fairs, going to mosques, going to churches, going to community centers and saying, we need to do better. And so we want to give you these opportunities. We want to open the door. And I know in some cases you are seeing positive action take place to really ensure that these bridges, or should I say the gaps are closing, and they're building bridges to make it easier for Black teachers to kind of step over and come in. But it's still hard teaching in general within the UK in terms of recruitment, because teaching's hard and is not the best profession in terms of how teachers are treated. And so as a result of that, it's like it's the encouragement to want to go in the profession anyway, and then ensuring that if schools are going to do that and they really want to recruit Black teachers, do they have the right culture? Because this is the other thing, Kwame, we have to be honest about. It's not just about getting a Black teacher into your school. Okay, I go into your school and I'm the first one, or one of two, or one of three. Is the temperament correct that I am going to walk in? Are you tempering your staff, tempering your parents, tempering your students so that they understand that cultural difference? Because the amount of racism that teachers therefore experience when they are the first one in a school that they have to battle, the schools are not prepared for the recruitment that they've just obtained. So I also say to schools, it's not just about having a Black face. Are you tempering your environment so you are ready for the culture you're inviting in? And that's a really important point we mustn't forget in that recruitment journey.
That is very true. But in order for school leaders to be prepared for new teachers coming in, whether they're coming right from the university or they're career changers, they had to have done the work. They had to have done the self-assessment of whatever biases, whatever preconceived notions they have about people from different historically marginalized backgrounds. They had to have done the work. And the issue, as you already know, Aisha, is a lot of these school leaders still don't do it. Even at the international school level, where you have a lot of heads of schools who are white and European, as you've seen in many of your travels to different international schools, they haven't done the work. But what's happened is there's an alarming level of tokenism that's taken place where we're hiring teachers of color, but guess what? We're not going beyond that. We're just meeting the bare minimum standard, and that's no longer enough.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think what's really interesting about what you're saying, you know, as I mentioned to you earlier, I am currently now studying towards my doctorate, and the idea behind it is that I want to look at specifically the relationship between race and leadership education, and the positionality in particular that white leaders are in when they have the responsibility to embed anti-racist practice within their school settings. But my problem is really what a lot of schools are doing is they're not doing anti-racist practice. What they're doing is EDI with a flavor of race. And they want to do nice racism. They want to do the palatable version that makes them feel safe. And they don't want to speak truth to power. And what makes it really difficult is because what they're not doing is facing the honest truth about their genuine core beliefs and values. If we talk about the Black experience from the marginalized lens, they don't mind that. That's easy. Oh, what's it like for poor Black children? Oh, what's it like to be a poor Black member of staff? Almost the pity approach. But what we need is not pity. We need to use things like critical whiteness theory. Let's be really honest about how white people benefit from the current status quo. Let's talk about white supremacy. Let's talk about white oppression. Let's talk about the origins of colonization. Let's talk about how that legacy is still permeating our education system. Only when we do that can we be honest about the change that we need to make. But we don't want to do that because it's so uncomfortable. Because now I might have to be honest that I have something that I've unearned, an unearned benefit, that I've had some structural advantage because of how I'm racialized. But people don't want to talk about that because this idea of meritocracy, but we've all got the same 24 hours and my family worked really hard and nobody handed anything to me on a plate. And no, you're right in that regard. But we would be remiss to not talk about the disproportionality that exists from the lens of the Black experience and how we don't live in a post-racial society. And that 600 years ago legacy is still living and breathing within us today. And when you take the UK, for example, we are the most marginalized in every indicator: health, judiciary, policing, education. So we cannot ignore the fact that anti-Blackness is alive, and if we don't acknowledge that and we're not willing to hold the mirror, then how on earth are we as educators ever going to make a change to the system that truly allows anti-racist practice to come forth? Because I have to believe that it even exists in the first place and acknowledge it to be able to make a change. And I think that's what's really important for leaders, for teachers, for practitioners. Let's talk the truth, but the truth is too uncomfortable, and that's why we avoid it. and it becomes performative.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Like what you're describing is a reflection of what's happening in the States as well. Everything you've mentioned up until this point, we're what, 26 minutes in? You haven't said anything that I haven't seen in my own experience as a teacher in all those years in the States. But I want to stay on this DEI conversation for a second. And I want to present some data pertaining to the future of DEI.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Janice Gasamasari, who is an anti-racist consultant, does a lot of great work in that field. She went ahead and did a poll on LinkedIn, I want to say a few months back, and she posed a question: what do you believe is the future of DEI in America? So I want to go ahead and present those findings for our viewing audience
Mm-hmm.
and just read off some of the results. I'll zoom in a little bit too so people can see. So here we have 40% of people saying that there'll be less investments and funding on DEI related work. You have 25% saying that there's a less focus on race and racism. 16% believe that things will remain as they are with this work. And then you have 19%, close to 1/5 of the 570 people who took part in this poll, who believe that DI is dead. So this
Mm-hmm.
is what's happening in the States. My question to you is, as it pertains to schools within England and the greater UK, do you believe that EDIB work is happening in a similar trend to the States? What would you say is your take on what's happening with regard to EDIB work in schools?
I very much agree that we are mirroring the States. And the problem that you have is we often look to the States almost like, oh, what are they doing over there, over the other side of the pond, almost for inspiration,
Yeah.
which I find quite interesting. But what's interesting about the UK, if you just take the UK specifically, we in 2022, schools were given policy and guidance called the impartiality guidance. And what that was saying to educators what they could and could not talk about in schools. That caused a lot of contention because one of the things it basically talked about was the fact that you can't talk about things like privilege. You can't talk about white privilege. You've got, and if you do, you've got to talk about it as a contested fact. You need to talk about both sides. And so what happened was it left educators feeling quite confused. What can I and can I not say, and what would be unlawful? We had a lot of political kind of clout that was coming from people from the global majority, almost going against what would be best for those from the global majority. So whether it's politicians saying multiculturalism has failed, but these people are South Asian, or whether you've got Black folk who are representing going, oh, we shouldn't be doing this in schools. Anti-racist practice has no place. It's partisan. It's not useful. We don't need to do this. The UK is the best place for Black people to live, so we should just be grateful for that. All of that rhetoric is not helpful when that's coming from our political parties, because what it is co-signing the view that we don't need to do this. It doesn't have a place. It doesn't have a value. And so it's made it very difficult for educators to be really clear. Well, what do we do? Because it's not legislated on per se. It's just guidance. But there are aspects of it which could be deemed to be unlawful. And so what you do is you create fear, and then people go, I'm just not going to do anything because I don't want to get it wrong. But what I've experienced from personally is schools still want to grapple with it. So I am aware of schools who are going, I get what the guidance is and I understand the political position, but as a school, it is a safeguarding concern if a child in our school is not safe because of how they are racialized. So if somebody's race means that someone's being caused harm, be it physical, emotional, spiritual, whatever it may well be for that individual child, then it would be remiss of me not to address that, as I would with any other safeguarding concerns. So I think where schools are able to channel it is we need to address it from the point of view of harm. Is our curriculum, is there pastoral interactions, is our physical environment causing harm to children because of how they're racialized? And if it is, then that gives us the mandate to make change. But what's really interesting in the UK, Wales as a country has actually mandated it. So in Wales, talking about Black history is mandatory. It is non-negotiable. And they've done this across all of their sectors. So whether it's health, whether it's policing, whether it's education, they did this whole manifesto about anti-racist practice and wanting to be an anti-racist country. And so there is a requirement that everybody has to do this in Wales, whether they like it or not. Whereas in England, it is still optional. So there is no consistency because I can pick and choose if I wish to engage. And that's been quite problematic.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Okay, so you mentioned the impartiality guidance policy, which is very similar to a lot of the anti-critical race theory laws that are being implemented stateside. And there's a lot, and it's mostly Republican, conservative states where it's happening, but it's starting to get into some of the blue states as well. But I had a question because I know there is the Equality Act in the UK that's supposed to provide some protections for people in the workplace against discrimination. So now I have two questions. One, does the Equality Act also include children? And I'm asking this because if we have this impartiality guidance policy that is censoring scholarship and curriculum that in a way is supposed to affirm students of the global majority, and it's a safeguarding issue, wouldn't that be a violation of the Equality Act if you just think about it logically?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really complex, which then puts educators into this spiral, go, what do we do? Because if we look at the Equality Act, it has what's called a public sector duty. So all teachers are bound by this in the UK. We have to adhere to it. And so you've got your 9 protected characteristics, of which race is one. We have to eliminate discrimination. We have to advance equality of opportunity, and we have to foster good relationships between the protected groups. It is a non-negotiable. We have to do it. And since 2012, schools not only have to do it, they legally have to comply with it by having equality objectives. They have to put it on their website. They have to update every year. So you've got this requirement. And then there's this confusion where you go, but now we've got this impartiality guidance that's saying we can talk about it, but as long as we talk about both sides. But what's the opposite? What's the opposite of not being racist? Is it not to be? And so the question is, what do you say? And so this is where it gets complicated because people don't know how far they can go with the conversation. So people feel very comfortable to go, yes, we shouldn't be racist in the UK. Yes, we shouldn't have hate crimes. No, it's wrong to use the N word or the P word. Those things are wrong. But when you start talking about system, we're talking about institutional racism, we're talking about policy, process, guidance, and how that then spills out into things like curricular and pastoral support and safeguarding guidance. This is where people feel that it's murky and they're not clear and they don't know what that looks like because they're not sure how to navigate that conversation. They don't feel that they've got that kind of that sense of knowledge or autonomy to address it. And because there's no consistency, you could have one school that would go, teaching this means this, and another school that goes, teaching that means that. So it's a postcode lottery as to what perspective you're going to receive. And then that goes back to what we said at the beginning, the positionality of the teacher and the leaders who are delivering the view, the voice, the opinion. It then becomes very subjective. What do you do with that? I mean, I'll give you a really good example whilst I'm not trying to make it overly political, but just to mention, you know, and I'm mindful on your podcast, I don't want to do that to you, but when we just think about the conversation that's been happening about how do schools talk about Israel and Palestine, that's been wild. Schools don't know what to do because the government have said one thing. They're aware that they should be promoting and supporting and advancing more than one narrative on the story. You've been told we've got to teach it, so both sides. How do I handle it? What do I do? And it's been very interesting watching how schools navigate that conversation. Some have felt very safe and confident and unapologetic. Some have gone, well, if I say anything, I'm casting a view and that's too political. And then you've got some who are like, well, I'm going with whatever the government said.
I mean, that's real. I mean, same thing happened in the States. You mentioned genocide. That's like career suicide for some teachers.
Absolutely.
But that's exactly what's happening. And that is, in essence, adhering to the Equality Act, because you might have Palestinian students in your classroom.
Absolutely.
So we're going to violate the Equality Act in order to adhere to the impartiality guidance policy. It doesn't make any sense. I'm even getting confused rationalizing and processing.
It's hard. It's a hard conversation. Nobody wants to be cancelled. Nobody wants to be cancelled publicly. Nobody wants to lose their job. Nobody wants to be disciplined. And so whilst I guess as people working outside of employment with a school, I guess we have a bit more freedom to say the things that we want to say. But even within that, there is still an element of us even still being cautious of what we say in the spaces that we're in. Even us recording a podcast, we're still mindful of the things we say because you don't want it to be misconstrued or utilized or people to cut and paste, different bits of your conversation. We still have to be mindful of that. Yes. But to work in a school and be aware that you could be doing something that could be bringing your school into disrepute, it's a really difficult conversation to have. And so even when I meet schools, I say to them, are you on an inclusion journey or are you on an anti-racism journey? And are you ready to take those steps if that's what you want to do? Is that truly where you're going? Do you have the policy and the process and the autonomy? And are you ready to tackle whatever traction comes with that commitment? And it's not that I'm trying to deter them. I absolutely want them to understand anti-Blackness and for them to understand how racism permeates education and what we need to do to genuinely be racially literate and put the right praxis in place. But what I would also say is, do you understand your commitment? And I'm not sure they always do.
Yeah, and that's real. That is real. So I want to try to get the chronological order of events for you. So you were in administration at your last school.
Mm-hmm.
And at what time did the impartiality guidance policy get implemented? When did it become official?
So 2022. So I was out by then. So I was quite fortunate in the sense that I came out similar time to you in that regard. So 2019, 2020, but just when the pandemic hit, that was me exiting. So I did what we called at the time COVID school. So we had to be in school to support the children because of key workers. So I kind of did that aspect of it. But I had already launched my company at that point. So I was kind of part-time in and out. So by the time the impartiality guidance came out, I was no longer in a position where I had to kind of implement that in schools. I was able to be on the outside of it and kind of be part of the debates and the negotiations and the conversation and the advice. I didn't have to be the one actually delivering it. But I found that so interesting because my positionality on it was very different because I had the autonomy to discuss it and unpick it because I wasn't subject to employment by a school. I was my own employer. Whereas I think for the teachers I was interviewing and who were conversing with me, there was a real fear. Oh my goodness, Aisha, if we now have this conversation, are we being unlawful? I really want to support this work. I want to look at anti-racist practice. But if I do so, are my actions wrong? Am I making mistakes? Could I lose my job? And it was a real fear, and a fear that I think still exists for many.
Still does for sure. So let's talk about Representation Matters, right? So you leave your school, you decide to start your own organization, which is also the name of the book that you will end up writing. And I'm wondering, what was it like to make that transition from the school to now you're pretty much a full-time entrepreneur? Like, you are freelancing, you are doing your own thing, and you have autonomy over your professional future and career. So let's talk about that transition into Representation Matter and how that went about.
I was quite fortunate that I was able to start this work before I transitioned out completely. So I had done the BBC documentary in 2018 when I was still employed. Soon after that, I did my TED talk, Why Representation Matters. So I'd already began to kind of dabble a little bit with kind of some of those kind of public appearances while still being employed with my school. What I also got the opportunity to do was begin to go and do conferences and keynotes and podcasts. So it wasn't a complete switch. It was a graduated kind of process. And I think what was quite clear was I was enjoying the impact I could have by being out of the classroom than I was being specifically located to one school, one classroom, one set of children. And so that journey for me was very fluid. It was almost like the natural step, the next step in my progression. And I'd always sat on groups. I'd always been into advocacy and social justice. I had been a specialist leader in education for community and EDI for some time. So going out and kind of championing voice and kind of supporting schools on that journey was always part of what I did anyway. So the real transition was you're no longer employed to do this through your trust. You are now independently doing this in your own right. And now you need to go and source your own work. And it was quite a big step because at the beginning, I didn't have any work. It was like, oh, I'm going to try this. I'm going to test the water. I'm going to see what comes in. But if we're being really honest, the game changer was when George Floyd was murdered. When he was murdered and we were in the middle of a pandemic, it was a game changer because at that point, all of a sudden, everyone's going, we now have a mandate to talk about race. We now have permission. So it doesn't matter what else is going on. We now need to have this conversation. And so it galvanized and reignited the conversation in the UK, literally. And it was like, help. And then all of a sudden, my diary was full, bookings were flowing, and the business expanded at a rate that I didn't even anticipate. And then it was a very easy transition from that point because all of a sudden, people want you to come and talk, share, explain. And it's so funny because, having been in this space, there was a time where I was begging people to talk. I was like, give me a platform, let me speak, let me advocate about race, let me talk about inclusion. And it was a bit like, nah, 2020 happens and it's like, you're inundated, come, talk about it. And that was really interesting for me. So I think time-wise, it was, I guess it happened at the right time. And it's unfortunate that someone was murdered for it to happen. And that doesn't feel good. But I guess if there is good that came out of it, it gave me a mandate to do what I do. And, 3.5 years down the line now, we've worked with almost 300 different schools on their journey around anti-racism and inclusion. And for me, I couldn't have asked for a better opportunity to really make a difference to what's happening in the UK education system. And for me, that's powerful. There's privilege in what I've been able to do. And I don't underestimate how fortunate I have been to be in this position.
And as you know, the work that we do, this anti-racist education work that we do, it requires the collective, it requires community. And I know that when you did your book, Representation Matters, Become an Anti-Racist Educator, there's no way that you could have written that book without the inclusion of different voices from the global majority. And I'm speaking as somebody who's writing a book that's similar in subject matter to what you wrote. And one of the things that I found very difficult was that we all know that each community you talk about is not monolithic. And it's not just 100%. In the phenotype and the culture, it's even in the way they think about the history, how they view the same history that they're a part of, how they look at different situations. So I'm wondering, in your situation, how were you able to write this book knowing the complexities and nuances that are within each of these different historically marginalized communities? And we're not even incorporating the LGBTQIA plus angle as well, because then that brings another layer into the conversation. But I'm just curious to know what your process was, because I know mine was very messy, as it should have been. And I appreciate the messiness.
I think I enjoyed the messiness because what it allowed me to do was understand and make the point. I don't speak for the Black experience. And what was really important for me is that it needed to be really intersectional. So in the book, you are hearing from people who are still students to those who have been through the education system and come out the other end. You know, you had gender difference, you had difference in proximity, you had racialized different, you know, two people who wrote in the book were racialized as white, and they talked about their experiences as parents or as educators, navigate their own journey and proximity to race and racism and what it meant for them. And what was so important for me was really making sure that that voice was understood in whatever way that individual needed it to be. And so when we think about being, and you know that I'm dyslexic, my son has ADHD, so we are very much steeped in the neurodistinctiveness that we have and our neurodiverse community, is that I also needed to make space for people to show up however they felt. So for some individuals, it was very conversational, like you were sat in the room. For some, it was very practical and pragmatic and functional. But it didn't matter to me. What mattered is that you heard the voices of the people that live and breathe this experience, and that there was a real intersectional experience that was taking place, and that we could hear from different ages, different experiences, those who were being currently taught, those who had taught and weren't teaching now. But there was something very beautiful and cathartic about the process for me, and it became beautifully uncomfortable. That's how I would describe it. And it was almost like the book I wish I had, but was never written when I was in that position. And now there's a plethora of books available for you as an educator, but there certainly was a moment in time where there wasn't a book you could have picked off the shelf that talked about all of these intersectional things in one place. And so what was really important for me was to give the lived experience, validate what people had been through, give them a voice to be amplified, because it isn't about hearing Aisha's voice, it's about hearing the voice of those around me. It was about also putting Bristol on the map, because often everything's very London centric. And whilst I understand that London's very multicultural, it's a different experience. Living in the Southwest, where there is less diversity racially, is important that those voices were heard as well. So to give people power in their words, for them to speak their truth, what was really, really important to me. And what it did is then allowed a framework for us to recommend change, for us to give people tips and hints. And one of the most beautiful things about the book for me was the way it spread. And it was only about a month ago, I was in London for a client, and we went to go and get some food. And a lady walked up to me and went, "You're Aisha Thomas." And I'm going, "Yeah." And then she goes, "I've read your book." And I went, "Oh, okay, nice to meet you." And people say that. No, she read the book. She started quoting things that was in the book. I'm like, did I write that? Just remembering what was in the book. And then she said,
Wow.
"I'm Venezuelan." And she said, "I've done a tutorial on YouTube with my daughter about your book. And what you've done for me is you galvanized me to make a change in Venezuela. And so as a result of that, I've now put together a program that's changing the racialized diversity of the books that we give to children in Venezuela." And she said, "Meeting you today was serendipitous." She's like, "I can't believe that you are in London today in the same restaurant as me. Like, what's the chances I would have been in there?" And she could tell me this story and give me the link to the YouTube video that she made about me. And I was like, wow. So when you write a book, you don't know who you're touching. You don't know who's going to get access. You don't know the impact. And for her, it was such a permission to speak her truth. And she was just like, "Thank you. You don't realize what you did for me and my daughter." And I'm going, I just wrote a book. I didn't know somebody in Venezuela was going to get it, pick it up and read it. So you never know your reach, Kwame. You never know where your book is going to go. You don't know who you're going to touch, who's going to access it, and whose life it might change. And sometimes that feels a bit cliche and a little bit cheesy. But the reality is the work we do changes lives. Not only does it change lives, the work we do sometimes is life-saving, because it's that moment of inclusion and validation that makes someone feel that I've been seen, I'm valued, I'm needed. And the work we do might be the thing that saves a child, saves a member of staff, because their bias and prejudice is now being recognized, being acknowledged, and being dealt with. And that is priceless. You cannot put a tag on it.
But I think it's important to know too that when we're in this movement, we all have a role that we can play. And in your case, you said you were going to write a book that's going to speak on these different identities. I decided I'm going to go ahead and start a podcast and bring on people who may know a little bit more than I do about certain topics, so they can share what they know by providing a platform for them to do that. Because let's be honest, there aren't a whole lot of affinity spaces for educators where they can speak their raw, unfiltered truth, because
100%.
that's just going to lead to them jeopardizing their careers, and it's still a fear to this day. So yeah, I totally agree. You just don't know how far your works travel. You think you're just focusing on Bristol, but then you realize, no, like I'm impacting people in other parts of the globe that I could not have even imagined. But I want to go ahead and get a little personal with you, because you did mention your son. You also talked about your experience with dyslexia, growing up with it. And one of the things that I've come to notice about this work that we do, dealing with intersectionality and different identities, is there's
Mm,
not a whole lot of focus, not enough focus on neurodiversity.
yeah,
There
absolutely.
just isn't enough focus on that, and just on ableism in general, and the
Mm-hmm,
intersections that it has with racism within
mm-hmm,
the educational space. So
mm-hmm.
I would love to know from you, how has your own experience with dyslexia and just being neurodivergent, how's that made you more conscious of those intersections between anti-ableist and anti-racist work?
Do you know what the honest truth is? And it's funny when people put these questions to you, because you go back and you go back to the way you behaved. I'm gonna be honest with you. I hid it for years. For years, I hid the fact that I was dyslexic, because I already knew how hard it was to be an educator. I already knew how hard it was to be racialized as Black. I already knew how hard it was to be a woman. So I'm already walking into the education space with all of this already upon me. And you want me to tell them that I'm dyslexic too? Particularly when the world
Mm,
already wasn't supportive of those who were neurodiverse. Dyslexia was considered as something that was going to hinder you. Oh, that means you can't read and write, or that means you're not going to perform and excel. I was not prepared to give them any power or any opportunity to tell me why I didn't belong there, because I already had to deal with the stuff I couldn't control. That you can say I'm Black, you can say I'm a woman. Those were already enough barriers that I'd have to contend with. So I made my life harder. So, I'd have to read a document and I would ask for it early to look like I was being earnest and eager. No, I was trying to disseminate it and read it a day in advance so that when I was in that meeting, I was able to converse with everybody else. They didn't know the extra hours I was putting in. When I'm, marking children's books, I'm having to make sure that I've got my dictionary on my phone with me so that when I'm writing, I'm not incorrectly putting poor spelling or incorrect grammar when I'm giving them feedback. It's taken me maybe twice or even 3 times as long as my fellow peer to mark a book, but I didn't share. And when I look back now, I could have asked for that accessibility. I could have asked for that differentiation. But there was such a fear that how dare you be Black in this space? Do you not already understand how privileged you are? And you want to bring neurodiversity to the table. You want to bring dyslexia to the table. I was like, no, I'm not prepared to do it. But what changed things for me, if I'm being honest with you, was my son. So my youngest son is the one that has
mm,
a diagnosis for ADHD. And he had an horrendous time at primary school when he first started. And so much so that a lot of what went down for him was that he was being treated as if to say he was poorly behaved. Oh, a naughty little Black boy. That's how he was treated. And things were being put down as behavior. Things were being put down as safeguarding. And I could already see the traits that I had in myself for him. And so I paid for a private assessment of his dyslexia, first of all. And then I started sending him to the dyslexia school. And I remember him looking at me going, Mummy, I'm silly. Mummy, I'm not smart. Mummy, I'm not good. Mummy, I can't read or write. And it was at that point I was like, do you know what? I need to let this boy know, my son know I'm dyslexic too. I now need to go out there and be proud of all I've achieved against the odds and the way that I've literally hidden my disability, my inability for all this time. And it was him. It was him that made me speak up and become public about what I'd been through. And I wanted him to see the fact that it wasn't a hindrance to be dyslexic. In fact, for him, it was going to show him his brain wiring, how creative he could be, how he might be able to excel verbally, even if he couldn't in written form. But what I then began to realize is there were other issues for him, other difficulty, which then led to him getting a diagnosis for ADHD. And what was really important for me was for him to not see that as something that was going to hold him back, but instead just for him to recognize it was going to be different. And the reason why I was really happy about that is because the amount of Black boys that are in prison or in mental health institutions undiagnosed because they didn't get the support to recognize that their brain is wired differently and that they needed different support and help. Being able to engage with it, being able to be honest about it, being able to face it, particularly as you might know as well, within our culture sometimes, certainly like my grandparents, what's this nonsense about ADHD? That's a load of nonsense. And sometimes I'd be like, listen, you just need to pray it away. That's what you need to do.
Yep.
And so what was really important was me to say, Nanny, I accept prayer and I believe in God, but sometimes I need to do something that's going to help him in a different way, and not being afraid to go, I need help. I need support. He needs help. He's now thriving. He has a key worker. He has a support plan. He has the scaffold he needs in school. He knows how his brain works. He knows what he needs. He knows what he doesn't like. And I think it's really important that we understand the danger if people who are racialized as Black do not recognize where that these things might also be occurring. Because what can sometimes happen is the lens that's put on it is that you're naughty, you're poorly behaved, you're dysfunctional, rather than recognizing, no, my brain's just wired differently and this is how I approach things. And when we think about movies and media, how often is disability depicted? Whether we're talking about physical disability or neurodiversity, just think about how it's perpetuated. Often it's made fun of. People will dress up as people with disability for Halloween and things. It is not celebrated at all. And so when we think about that and we navigate that conversation, we have to therefore recognize what we need to do differently to really celebrate and showcase that difference, but not see it as you are lesser than as a human being. So I guess what I love about now is that my son doesn't have to. He can be front and center and he can be honest in a way that I couldn't be for pretty much the first 30 years of my life.
And I think by seeing you reclaim and proclaim your own power by writing a book and starting an organization, doing all these incredible things you're doing, that is a major triumph, not just for you personally, but also it allows your son to see what's possible.
Irrespective.
Because he sees that, you know what? My mother is the counter story that I need in order to believe that anything is possible for me. And that's the most powerful part of this entire story. And you know what? I think this is a perfect place to land this conversation. I actually want to ask you one more question to wrap everything up. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
By not forgetting where I started. And for me, even if I'm not in the classroom, my proximity to young people, my proximity to children, the essence of youth, you can't lose that connection. And I think sometimes what can happen, particularly when you go into administration, when you go into those leadership and consultancy positions, you lose your proximity. And so what I do is I go out of my way, even if it's from a charitable lens, if it's from the lens of volunteering my time, I need to keep that connection and that vibrancy with the very people I'm doing the work for. So I'm not afraid. Like yesterday, I was at a session with some young people. I'm not afraid to go and be in those spaces. It's so important that I show up in all of those spaces too. And so I take those opportunities and I talk and I converse and I share and I listen, because children keep you young, and understanding their experience, the generational difference, is so vital. And so I guess, how do I keep connected? I just don't disconnect.
And that's the most important thing. Kids give you energy. They just give you the energy that you need to keep on going. I miss that energy sometimes, not being in the classroom. So I totally feel what you're saying. But Aisha, we've made it to the hour. It's been an incredible conversation. I could talk to you all day, honestly. Thank you for taking time to talk with me today. And before I let you go, let people know how they can connect with you either on social media or through your website. You can even let them know about Representation Matters, where they can get the book if they don't have it already in
Yeah,
the library.
absolutely.
The floor is yours.
Yes, that's awesome. So, first of all, can I just say thank you? It's not often that I get to be in these spaces where we can just have an authentic conversation without any scripting. There's nothing that anyone's trying to get out of it. So I appreciate your candor and your approach. So I really, really appreciate that. So thank you for providing the platform for that. You're doing great work, and please don't ever lose sight of that, even if sometimes it can be difficult or tricky. So please keep doing what you do. You're awesome, and I wish you the best with what you do. In terms of the company, so we have a website, so you can go to www.repmatters.co.uk, where there's a wealth of resources that really talk about the work we do. There's podcasts on there, there's videos, there's different blogs and things. So just for you to really learn a bit more about what we do and how we do it. We obviously have the Representation Matters book, How to Be an Anti-Racist Educator, that is available on Amazon. So please feel free. Obviously, there are other bookstores, but depending on where you are in the world, Amazon probably is the easiest place to purchase it from. In addition to that, we're on 2 key social media platforms. So we use Instagram, where it is at Rep Matters, or it's Aisha Thomas. And equally, we are also on LinkedIn under the same name. So Aisha Thomas for me personally, or for the business Representation Matters Ltd. And we'd be delighted to engage with you in any way that works for you. Seek us out, have a chat, let's converse, and let's keep connected.
All right, y'all heard it here. So make sure y'all connect with Aisha at the Representation Matters website and all of her socials. Please follow her. She's doing great work, and her voice is needed. Thank you again, and wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
All right, people. So we're about to end another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.